Hey everyone, welcome to the video. In this video, I want to talk about ideals, rules and expectations, and masculinity. Imagine that I invited you to play a game of basketball. In order for us to play that game with each other, we have to have a shared set of knowledge about how to play the game, knowledge about the rules, and knowledge about the goal of the game. So in basketball, as most people know, the goal is to score more points than your opponent. The rules of the game of basketball may vary, but some of them are pretty universal. You can't double dribble, you can't go out of bounds, you can't foul, you can't travel with the basketball. And like I said, there's some flexibility in the rules where NBA style basketball is different from street ball, and maybe how people play basketball in recreation leagues in New York is different from how they play in Atlanta. But generally speaking, there are rules that act as boundaries around the game of basketball that define it. That's how you know that we're playing basketball and we're not playing ultimate frisbee, we're not playing chess, and we're not playing football. So for a game to exist, you need rules and you need an ultimate aim or a goal. Both the rules and the goal allow individuals to judge the goodness and badness of their behaviors when they're playing the game. These rules and maybe even the aim can be negotiated, but they still must be adhered to even play the game. So here's another example. I mentioned chess earlier. When you're playing chess, there's an ultimate aim, a purpose, which is to beat your opponent, to put them in checkmate. And then there are rules in terms of how each piece is supposed to move. And when the players are deciding to play a chess game, they are both accepting the goal and the set of rules. And when some people today think about rules and boundaries and expectations, they associate that with a form of rigid order that doesn't allow creativity. But the thing about chess that's so interesting is because of the purpose, the aim, and the rules that define the game of chess, you can have a near infinite number of possible moves and potential strategies that can be played in a given chess game. And another part about the dynamic of chess, like most games, is that you can play them over a long period of time. And so that just expands the diversity that you can get within the structured game of chess. So you get this dynamic where a goal and rules that establish boundaries and the judgment for certain behaviors allow for a plethora of diverse strategies to be enacted. Without the purpose of chess and without the rules, you couldn't even play the game. So that's something that I think we misunderstand in our culture. We think of order and rules and the assertion of a standard as excluding people or not accounting for the diversity that is a very real part of human nature and how we evolved. But at the same time, we fail to account for this other element of order. There's this Navy SEAL that I follow and I admire. His name is Jocko Willink, and he has this saying that discipline equals freedom. And my interpretation of that quote is that in your life, if you don't have any rules, if you don't have an aim that helps you orient yourself in your life, well, then it's very difficult to know what's good and bad, and it's very difficult to know where you are. It's easy for you to become lost. It's easy for you to follow every new trend and to just conform to what other people are doing. You can think about this in terms of fitness. When you're playing the game of trying to get swole, or you're playing the game of trying to become a better marathon runner, you have the same structural mechanics there. You have a purpose, and you have a set of rules. When it comes to trying to get stronger in the gym, well, first you have to clarify your goal and you have to specify it. And it doesn't have to be perfect. There's levels of specificity and there's different ways to be stronger. But either way, you have to set that goal yourself. And then once you set that goal, there are certain rules. Not only given that if you're working on a public gym, there are social expectations and social rules that you have to adhere to. But even if you have your own gym, there are constraints that we can think of as rules that are imposed upon you given our reality, given the physical reality, given the nature of your genetics and your biology. There are just certain things that you can and can't do if you're trying to get stronger. And once you set the goal, you can define the goodness and the badness of your technique, the goodness or badness of your workout plan in terms of whether or not you're moving towards that goal. So a goal is necessary. Rules and expectations set the boundaries that enable us to understand what it is that we're trying to do as we're navigating our environment. The reason that I wanted to talk about games, basketball games, the game of fitness or the game of chess is because you can think of your life as a set of iterated games where you're navigating different aims, you're trying to adhere to certain rules, and you're evaluating the goodness or badness of certain rules. And so many of those principles that I just discussed, I believe, can be implemented into your game of your relationship or your marriage or your game of trying to get promoted at work. I believe that the same principles apply. And one area in our culture where I think this breaks down and where we are struggling to understand the importance of an aim, a set of standards, and rules and expectations is in the discussion about masculinity and femininity. For this video, I think I'm going to focus on masculinity depending on the time, but we are afraid in our culture to say that masculinity is XYZ, and we're also afraid to say that femininity is XYZ. When you do that, it is very similar to asserting an ideal or asserting a standard. For example, when I think of masculinity, I think of the different people in my life that I admire, as well as the people on social media that I like to imitate and try to mold my life in an image of. So people like I mentioned, Jocko Willink, this super strong, super swole father, Navy SEAL, business owner, excellent communicator, very intelligent, just an overall great leader. So that's one person that I admire. I also admire someone like Nick Bare, who is similar to Jocko. Military background, he's a father, he's married, he has a podcast, he has a business, he's written some books. Another person that I admire is Jordan Peterson. Again, there are similar themes that are manifesting across the people in my life that I see, that I admire when it comes to an ideal image of masculinity, but also an ideal image of being a good person. But again, trying to focus on masculinity. To say that these people do a good job of embodying masculinity implies that there are other men or other people who do not embody the ideal image of masculinity. And in our politically correct culture and in our current social milieu where we value compassion and inclusivity and diversity, we don't like to say things like that. Again, I think that's something that we misunderstand. Just like in chess, when you can assert an ideal chess game, you say that there's a goal in chess that everyone's trying to work towards, and you also say that there are rules in terms of things you can and can't do in chess. With those constraints, you still get a wide variety of ways to be a good chess player. But what I think is happening in our culture would be the equivalent of saying, well, you can play chess however you want. You can bring a soccer ball to a chess game, and you can just flip the chessboard over, and you can actually bring checkers to the chess game. Like, that's what I feel like we're doing. I feel like we are saying that there is a wide spectrum of masculinity and what that means, which is true. That's completely true. You have people like Michael Jackson and Prince who are within the category of masculinity, and then you have people like Jocko Willink that I just mentioned who are also very masculine. So you have this wide variety, and that is true. But then we take it a step too far and say, well, given that variation of masculinity, there is no average and there is no optimal way to be masculine. There is no ideal. And that's something that I disagree with. And a big part of what I want to talk about in this video is just the importance of maintaining the idea of an ideal when you're trying to play a social game, when you are trying to perceive the world, and when you are trying to embody these certain categories. Look, imagine what a woman does when she's trying to find a partner. She will conjure up an image of in her mind of what she wants in a man. And that image is a construction that comes from many different sources. It'll come from the way she was raised. It'll come from her image of her father. Maybe she has some brothers. Maybe social media is telling her that she should want these certain traits in a man. And then she'll have her own idiosyncrasies that serve as ingredients for that constructed image of her ideal man. And that image is with her consciously or unconsciously as she is navigating the dating realm. So these categories, how we think of masculinity, femininity, a good person, a bad person, a good marriage, a bad marriage, they impact how we perceive and behave in the world. And so it's important for us to get on the same page socially if we're all trying to play the same game. So let's dive into masculinity. When I think of masculinity, in its ideal form, I think of disciplined order. I think of rationality and reason. I think of the kind of discipline and order that creates a safe and protective environment for women and children. I think of men who are willing to sacrifice of themselves for women and children. Masculinity, like femininity, also has positives and negatives. And so what I described there, you could imagine is more so the positive, but the negative element of masculinity would be the pathology of order and discipline, and the image that can come to mind of a suboptimal way of being a man is to be a tyrant or to be a dictator. When I was in the Marine Corps, many of my commanding officers, my executive officers were amazing men, and they embodied to varying degrees and in different ways this ideal image of a man that I tried to portray. But the bad leaders, the bad officers, they were the ones who never wanted to listen to anyone else. They were arrogant, they were hubristic, they were totalitarian in their mindset such that they believed that they already had total knowledge of everything that was going on. And so no one could tell them anything. And from their perspective, a totalitarian mindset of too much order and too much discipline, to use that word, it makes everything predictable from their standpoint. If you already know everything, well, then you don't have to learn anything new. And from your perspective, nothing in the world is new because you already know everything. And people can adopt that mindset because it is difficult to learn something. It is difficult to have to update your old knowledge structures. And many people, particularly in our political realm and in the political discourse, don't like to have their beliefs challenged because it destabilizes their worldview and forces them to have to contend with novelty and to update themselves. And that could be painful sometimes. Imagine if you have thought about the world in a certain way for the past 2 or 3 decades and come to find out you were wrong. No one likes to do that. So it makes sense why people cling to their tyrannical beliefs. But that is one way that you can think of what people might call toxic masculinity. So you can say that masculinity has an ideal form. You can say that it has positives and negatives. And you can also say that it exists on a spectrum where, like I mentioned, I had many good Marine Corps leaders, but given their temperamental variations and their different experiences, they were good in different ways. So you can acknowledge all of that while still saying that there is a way to be a good man, there is a way to be a good leader, and there are ways to be bad men, and there are ways to be bad leaders. So going back to our example of our female who's looking for a partner, she's going to think, how can I find a good man, a good husband, a good father, someone I can live with for a very long time who will be a good grandfather eventually? And she has to think about, what are the things that I want in my life? And again, in this example, each person, when they're trying to find a mate, will have their specific nuances, but I'm trying to speak generally and speak at a collective level. Depending on the image that she generates in her mind, she will then project that out in the form of expectations when she's dating men, and she will project that out as the form of a goal. And the goal in her mind to get a good man, a good husband, a good father of her children, her future children, that will orient her perceptions. And so when she's on the date, she will see certain things and she'll notice certain patterns of attention that the man is doing, and that may or may not align with the image that she has in her mind. And this can all be done unconsciously, of course, and that might manifest in, kind of bad feeling, like, oh, she doesn't really like that guy because, he did X, Y, and Z. And so it's very important that we understand that we create ideal images of masculinity and femininity regardless of what society tells us. That's part of being human. It's part of playing this social game where we want a partner, and many of us want kids, and many of us want to get married and have grandchildren. When you are playing that game, you implicitly buy into the notion that there is some ultimate goal, and you might not know what that goal is, which is why it's important when you are dating to discuss that and to highlight it. And it's important for you to discover within yourself what it is that you are aiming at, but to partake in the conversation such that you might believe that there is no goal, there is no ideal way of being a man or being a woman or being a husband or being a wife. That leads you down a path of confusion and anxiety, the same way that if I was trying to play basketball with you, but you bring a football and you immediately start tackling me, I'm going to be very confused because I don't know what game we're playing. And it's difficult in our culture, particularly because of the many technological revolutions that are occurring. That have occurred, they are forcing us to reanalyze what masculinity and femininity mean. And I believe that we have strong biological and natural tendencies that push us to perceive and act out the ideas of masculinity and femininity in a certain way. But we are also rational and social creatures who can transmute and to some degree suppress our natural instincts. And so what we want is a balance between our natural proclivities and the ability to use our reason to implement those natural instincts in our current environment, which is different to some degree from what our ancestors had to go through. Those natural instincts that we have, our emotions, our motivations, they evolved over a very long time period to help our ancestors solve some of the problems that they have had. Now, in our current environment, we still have many of the same problems that they have, but we also have some different problems. And that's really the human condition. It's trying to figure out how to take these signals of ancient wisdom that we might see in our stories, for example, in our religious stories and in our mythological narratives about what men used to do, or about what the ideal man is and about what the ideal woman is, and how can we set those as motivated aims that help us play the games given the new experiences that we have in our current environment. The biggest example is just prior to women entering the workforce, let's go back really hundreds of years ago, really, the environment constrained what men and women did, given the natural differences of men and women and the natural strengths and weaknesses of men and women. And so it wasn't necessarily a natural or cultural push for men and women to do the behaviors that they did. But as we have become more advanced and we have technologically innovated, now those same constraints in the environment aren't there. And those constraints used to serve as certain regulating forces for us that gave us some form of identity, some form of purpose. And they, again, defined the game that we were playing, and we all understood the game. And so we knew what it was. But now we're in a different, somewhat, environment. And there are new rules, and there are new aims, and there are less constraints. And so now we're trying to have that discussion. But part of what I want to add to that dialogue is I don't think that it's beneficial to say that there is no ideal masculinity, nor is it productive to say that there is no ideal femininity. There are constraints to these categories if we're going to say that they exist at all. And if we're going to go down the path of saying that they don't exist, I think we're going to run into many problems with our own natural proclivities. To me, that would be too one-sided, and that would be us pushing too much in the direction of valuing our reason and our rationality and our intellect, and not listening to our more foundational being. That's not necessarily integrating our mind and our body. We are trying to become just the mind in that respect. And so we have to acknowledge that there are parts of us as individuals and as a species that have been around for millions of years at least. And the question becomes, how do we take those, let's say, natural masculine and feminine tendencies and integrate them such that we can continue playing this social game of trying to find partners and trying to have children and trying to live and maybe even flourish, so that way things can be better. All right, I think I'm going to end the video there. Thank you guys for listening. See you in the next one.